Good afternoon, everybody. I've had ample introduction, so I won't introduce myself more, except to say I've been working on immigration matters for the last 6 or 8 years, largely motivated by students at my charter school, where I've had to sit with a boy whose family came from Mexico and who would say, "Mr. Rowe, is it really true that I can finish high school and go to college and get a good job?" And the honest answer was, "I can help you finish high school, I can get you to a good college, but I wouldn't be legally allowed to employ you." And that always seemed like a great travesty to me and still does. So I've been working on this issue for some time, and once upon a time I chaired the Bipartisan Policy Center, where I was a stooge for certain environmental groups, which was actually fun. The Global Affairs Council and the Bipartisan Policy Center are both good organizations, and they're working very hard on immigration issues and also on the link between immigration and security. Because we live in a world where some people want to be pro-immigration and sound almost indifferent to security, and other people want to be pro-security and can't seem to remember that we're all either immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. So the issues clearly interact, and the issue is how to go about dealing with those interactions sensibly. It's particularly hard in this political season because we clearly have an electorate that is losing confidence in the center, and that is happening in both wings of the political spectrum. You could see it on the left in the large vote that Sanders got. You can see it more strongly in the right, if Trump is the right, on Trump winning and Cruz coming in second. We have a country that has reason not to trust its center at the moment. There are a whole lot of government failures in the 08-09 recession. There are a whole lot of business failures in the 08-09 recession. Large, prestigious, not-for-profit groups and universities aren't coping very well with the challenges of real people in poor communities. There are, unfortunately, reasons not to trust the center, but usually the alternatives are worse. The Council and the Bipartisan Policy Center have been trying to work on a paper with real experts on what is the link between immigration and security. And their conclusions will be very different than what's in the public mind. Polls say that most Americans feel the country is less safe than it was before 9/11. The statistics actually suggest that we are more safe. The experts think we are more safe. Fascinating who's right. We all know that most crime has nothing to do with immigration. But the crime that does have something to do with immigration, both in the U.S. and Europe, provokes very deep fears in people. And then we overlace that all with the fears that countries are becoming more different than some people want them to be. It's hard for me as an American, which is always a polyglot country, to put myself in the place of someone who's Greek dealing with immigration, or someone who's French asking what it means to be French. I mean, we've never been quite sure what it means to be American, so confusion is our natural lot. One thing I'm sure of is people like my friend Erie and my friend Becca are an asset to this country. So we're going to have a panel discussion today with some people who really think about these things, who know far more than I do, to try to talk about some of these issues which we can say, why are the right and the left so different? Or worse yet, why is the left and the right so suspicious of the center? And how do we get more secure while staying decent? One thing you have always known about U.S. immigration policy is we know how to be cruel. Being cruel is easy. Being safe and decent is hard work. So with that, I'll get out of here while I'm ahead and turn this over to our panel. It is my pleasure to introduce Salam Al-Mariyati, President of the Muslim Public Affairs Council and a frequent media commentator on Islam in the West, Michael G. Masters, Senior Vice President of the Sufan Group and a former Executive Director of the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management for Cook County, Illinois, Katie Tobin, Assistant Protection Officer, the UN Refugee Agency, and a former refugee officer with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, and my friend Teresa Cardinal Brown, who is Director of Immigration Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center and has worked at both the U.S. Chamber and in the Department of Homeland Security. Ladies and gentlemen, I join you in welcoming some people who actually know what they're talking about.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you to the Chicago Council. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd be remiss if I didn't give you a little bit of background about the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are a Washington, D.C. think tank that is bipartisan by design, and no, that is not a unicorn. We were founded in 2007 by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Tom Daschle, Bob Dole, Howard Baker, and George Mitchell, with the mission of bringing together interested partisans to try to find pragmatic solutions to some of our country's most difficult problems. Immigration certainly falls on that list, and the Immigration Task Force that John is a member of was started in 2013 with that mission as well. In addition to John, the task force is co-chaired by former governors Haley Barbour and Ed Rendell, who also happen to be former RNC and DNC chairs, and former secretaries Michael Chertoff of DHS and Henry Cisneros of HHS. So a pretty robust group of people who really believe that we can find that center that John alluded to. So I'm very pleased to be here today to speak with this distinguished panel of people about this intersection between immigration and national security. So I'm going to start with you, Salam. You heard John talk a little bit about that perception gap, if you will, that a lot of people seem to have about where we are as a nation in security and immigration. And I think your community suffers from that probably the most,
right.
That perception gap between what people think and what is real. So talk to us about your experience and what your community is feeling in this current environment.
Well, I think we have to understand that for the American Muslim community, the main problem is that they are perceived, and we do feel, that we are a suspect community. And what's driving that narrative is not necessarily happening in the United States. It's happening globally. And the repercussions of that are creating these points that Mr. Rowe eloquently discussed in his introduction. And that is the rise of religious nationalism. And there are groups around the world who believe that their regions should be run by religious nationalists. And that means that religion now is used as a political power, as an instrument for gaining political power. It becomes tribal, not universal. That is, religion becomes tribal, not universal. And that the ends justify the means. And so you create these conflicts that are based on religion. And in the United States, there is that similar pattern that we see where there's a rise of nationalism. And so anyone who is perceived as the other then is the enemy, is the suspect. And so there are problems that are imposed on our community that we have nothing to do with. there are issues that are happening in our community that the public doesn't see. And so the perception, however, becomes reality, and there is hysteria. And I think the answer to religious nationalism is religious pluralism. And if there's a place where we can start talking about religious pluralism, it is the United States. So the answer is in America, and the answer is with the American Muslim community, along with the Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist communities, to talk about what is our vision of religious pluralism, and how can that mitigate the problems of religious nationalism overseas. Because religious nationalism is what creates militancy, is what creates terrorism. When we deal with terrorism, we're only looking at a symptom. We're not looking at the cause of the problem.
Very interesting. So Michael, from your perspective as a security expert, you listen to Salam. Is that consistent with what you see? I mean, law enforcement has this sort of difficult thing to try to prevent criminal acts of terrorism while dealing with what's obviously a deeper problem.
So first, it's always an honor. I'm very grateful to be here, particularly with my friend and colleague, Salam. We've gotten the chance to do a lot of work for DHS together. The law enforcement conversation is a difficult one, particularly in today's day and environment. And there's a number of facets to it. So, to go back to the point that John was making in his introduction, a number of Americans feel less safe. Some Americans feel more safe. What I think that qualitatively we can say is that we are more safe as a country from the type of event that we saw on September 11th, 2001. But there are multiple other threats that continue to rear their heads in a variety of different ways and present new and unique challenges. And I think that the way to deal with those challenges most effectively is through a society that takes a whole community approach, that is religiously pluralistic, that brings people together and builds communities of trust between law enforcement and all of the communities that law enforcement has to serve. And the reality is that has not been the case in this country for many, many years with many, many different communities, whether they are black and brown communities or others. So I think that there is a real, we were speaking when we were reading about this issue of countering violent extremism and the terminology of CVE. I think that it is a very realistic proposition that many communities, particularly the Muslim community, feels that they have been unduly scrutinized, and there has been an overly securitized relationship with that community since 9/11. And that is because of law enforcement and the way that too many law enforcement agencies at every single level approached the problem. And it was not done in collaboration, it was done in opposition. And it created fear and insecurity where we could have been building relationships. And that is a phenomenon that is not unique. If we look at the relationship between law enforcement and the African American community in this country for not just the last 2 years, but the last 150 years, there are institutionalized structures where we haven't capitalized on our ability to build strong relationships and work together. And I think that we are seeing the outcomes of those where we are not able to work collaboratively together. And that means to do that, you need to break down the structures that we've existed in and the verticals that we've operated in and really work to try to understand one another. Nothing about you without you, right? Even the most simple thing of law enforcement training. How can we train law enforcement officers to operate in a community if we're not engaging the community in what that training looks like? The most simple of things, from walking into a mosque or a synagogue and how to talk to a religious figure or an individual, right? And it's counterintuitive to officers that the way they walk into an Orthodox synagogue to talk to someone as a female or male officer has a lot more similarity to the way that they might walk into a more traditional mosque than the way they might walk into a Reform synagogue. And we have to teach people, our law enforcement officers, about these nuances and differences to build those relationships of trust.
So Katie, you represent UNHCR, and for better or worse, these issues have come to a focus right now when we're talking about the issue of resettling Syrian refugees from Syria. I'll put it that way because they're more than just Syrians, right? How have how has UNHCR responded? Obviously, in this country, we've had a large debate. We've had governors who have said, we don't want to settle any refugees from that area in our state because we're afraid that there's a security risk. But you've been telling me that there are a lot of communities that are more welcoming right now. What are you seeing here?
Sure, and first of all, thank you so much. It's an honor for UNHCR to be a part of this discussion. It's a really important discussion. Comes at an important time, too, with the Refugee Summit that the President hosted this week. These issues are really on the forefront, so it's great to see this happening. This is a trying time for UNHCR, not only in the United States, the political climate here, but globally, we're seeing, a contrast of extreme generosity. Certain countries, especially in the region surrounding Syria, hosting millions of refugees, and then we're seeing at the same time an increased closing of borders, legal and physical barriers being put up at a time when we have record numbers of refugees in the world, 65 million refugees as of the end of 2015. It's the highest recorded number of refugees since World War II. So we're really facing a global crisis. In the United States, when you mentioned, I know it was announced this week that the governor of Texas is saying they won't admit more refugees. Certainly a disappointment. But at the same time that we're seeing things like that, we see so many cities doing really welcoming refugees. And I wanted to highlight Chicago. Is one for UNHCR is a real model city when it comes to welcoming and integrating refugees. Our new High Commissioner Felipe Grande, when he made his first visit to the United States earlier this year, we chose Chicago to showcase to him, to show him just what the U.S. Is doing to welcome refugees. We brought him around to meet there's many really wonderful refugee resettlement agencies here in Chicago, and then the private sector too. So many companies that are intentionally working with the resettlement agencies to hire refugees. A lot of the hotels, Eli's Cheesecake, our High Commissioner did a tour of the factory full of refugees from all over the world. It's really an inspiration. And so I think when we talk about needing to get the faith communities and local communities involved, you see a lot of excellent practices here in Chicago. So I think we need to highlight the good that's being done and not just focus on the bad. Chicago's not alone. There's some great initiatives happening in New York City, for instance, to make sure that all refugees have access to IDs and things like that. I spent World Refugee Day in Denver a few years ago and just couldn't believe what was happening on the ground level. So I'd like to see, I think, more of a focus on the positive than the negative, because there are really so many individuals and local, state, and federal leaders that really do care about refugees. So what seems to get the news, and when we're talking about refugees, is whether or not we can appropriately screen and vet them. That's the question that keeps coming up. Can you talk a little bit? UNHCR is the first to sort of encounter formally refugees where they are before they come to the U.S. government. Can you talk a little bit about the process you engage in there? What is done? How does that happen? I think a lot of the public doesn't understand it. They hear things and they presume things, but from your perspective, what does it look like? Sure, yeah, refugee resettlement's definitely been in the headlines quite a bit in the last year, but it is a process that is relatively unknown to the public. So when an individual crosses an international border and seeks refugee status, UNHCR is often there working with the host government to register that individual and to make a determination if they are eligible for refugee status. And that's a process that involves both determining whether they meet the criteria, the refugee definition, and then also a consideration of national security issues, criminality and such. Not all people fleeing persecution actually qualify as a refugee, and I think that's an important point for people to know. So once UNHCR recognizes them as a refugee, something interesting is that, so currently in the world, as of our 2015 numbers, there are 21 million refugees in the world, people that have had to flee their country and seek protection elsewhere. 0.5% of those individuals will benefit from refugee resettlement. So it's a little over 100,000
So most of them are going to
globally.
remain in the areas they first
Right.
flee to.
Right, that's right. So the majority of refugees will remain in a country of first asylum, often living in camps and hoping to eventually be able to return to their home country. So what UNHCR does is we have a whole resettlement criteria in place, and we have to prioritize. So we often choose cases that are most vulnerable, that are struggling the most in terms of security and healthcare and other issues in the camps. And we will then, and then we also look at cases that we think would be successful if we submitted them to a resettlement country such as the United States or Canada or Australia, several European countries. So then once a case is selected, then we submit it to the resettlement country, and it goes through a formal process. In the United States, that process often takes between 18 to 24 months. It's submitted first to the US State Department. There's a whole slew of security checks that are done. And then eventually an officer, I formerly served as a refugee officer on behalf of DHS, will go out into the field and do an adjudication, and more security checks are done. And then eventually, if the case is approved for admission as a refugee, then they will travel to the United States. So the process is a little bit different with each of our resettlement countries. The US is by far the most generous when it comes to refugee resettlement. In 2016, the US will resettle about 85,000, and the president just announced this week intentions of resettling 110,000 for the fiscal year 2017.
So because we're talking about national security, let me be clear. When you say generous, you mean in terms of numbers. Generosity, not necessarily in that we just open our doors to everybody. As you mentioned, there's a set of processes and criteria.
That's correct.
And
right.
so one other thing that comes up very frequently is this idea of, what are we checking against? These are people from countries that don't have formal governments anymore in the database. So can you talk any more at all about sort of that process? It's not just about the databases, right? You said you interview people. You actually sit down and talk to them. During that interview, you're ascertaining a lot of different things, not just their refugee status. You want to talk about that?
That's right. Yeah, and I'm sure
Michael can talk about it too. Yeah.
Discuss it as well. But a refugee is probably interviewed about 10 times from the time that they request refugee status to the time that I made up 10 times, but multiple times. So there's a whole credibility assessment. Officers, both with UNHCR and the governments that do these adjudications, are trained to identify adverse factors, but that's just part of it. Of course, then there's a lot of, we collect biometrics, the governments collect biometrics. We say that refugees are probably the most vetted immigrants that would enter the United States or any country. There's so many more steps involved in a refugee resettlement process than any other immigration process out there.
Michael, you're nodding there. You have some experience in the security issues. John talked a little bit about from your perspective, how has our system evolved to deal with security threats? Do you feel like, refugees being only a small slice of it, honestly, but where do we stand?
So let's start with refugees, because I think a lot of what was just stated is really important. The process itself takes 18 to 24 months. There are at least 2 to 4 on-the-book interviews without any question of an individual raising any sort of security concern. They go first through the biometric testing that is done through the Department of State. Every single person goes through the National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC. DHS is doing testing. Immigration is doing testing. There are multiple checkpoints. Now, all that, and we still have to say, no system is 100% foolproof. That is part of the risk we take when we have a policy where we allow anyone into this country. But save for our First Nations, we are all at some point immigrants to this country. And the reality is, from a security perspective, the refugee process is the least welcoming or potentially fortuitous for somebody who wants to take adverse action against this country or its residents, right? To wait 18 to 24 months to go through that process and planning when reasonably we're issuing 10 million visas every single year from visa waiver program countries, of which there are 38, and you can sign up for the ESTA program to come into the country quicker, is a ridiculous, sort of Potemkin village that has been set up in the political environment to be directed at one group of people that come from one specific background. And I think that we all owe a responsibility to talk about that issue, and also for the media to be informed and raise these points when they're reporting on it. From a security perspective, there are a lot of checks that go on for every single person that's coming to this country. Everyone that's getting a visa is going through the National Counterterrorism Center. And there have been incredible checks, and that is why we've been able to reach the president's goal of having 10,000 refugees from Syria brought into this country sooner than was anticipated. We hit the goal within the last 2 months. It was an annual goal. And I think that is because we have processes in place that are moving efficiently, but that are also highly secure. The reality is the threats we've seen in many of our cases, right, have come from what we would refer to as insider threats, people that have either been in this country for their entire lives or for a significant amount of time. And of the 545 people that have been shot and killed in this city since January 1, it has been not one single event that has been related to a refugee or a terrorism event at all. It is the daily crime that is happening in this country. And I would just make one other point. When the American people were polled, less than 5% supported raising immigration quotas or allowing refugees into this country. 2/3 said that we should keep people out of this country. And when Gallup polled, 2/3 also said that they were not even willing to allow 10,000 refugee children to be relocated to this nation. Those polls were not conducted this week, last month, or last year. They were conducted in 1938, and they revolved all around Jewish refugees. And this country put incredible barriers to allowing those refugees into this country. It is a part of our human commitment and a conscious decision that we have to make as a country that we can do better than that. And we have an opportunity to do better than that right now.
Salam, I want to ask you about a point that Michael raised about the media coverage, right? The media doesn't do a great job of actually realistically assessing what the risks are, and tends to overly focus on certain countries, certain issues, certain groups of people. What do you think the responsibility is of the media in trying to cover these things and balance these issues out?
Well, I think what we're missing is the human story of refugees. If you think about what they are undergoing, first of all, the trauma of a war-torn area where they've lost their homes. Many of them have lost their families. And they are trying to seek shelter and refuge. And to be told by the world powers that there is no shelter after they've gone through the trauma that much of which was created by Western powers. I mean, it was our country that started the war in Iraq in 2003 based on a lie that Iraq was involved in 9/11. And so that led to Al-Qaeda Iraq, which led to ISIS, and now we have this problem. And so they see that the world has turned their back on them. And when they try to flee, they are met with this notion that they are the enemy. They are the problem. They're dehumanized. And then from this side is the stories of people that want to reunite with their families, but they can't. People who are engaged to get married, but they have to break their engagement because their would-be spouse cannot arrive here, cannot gain entry to the United States. So there are so many stories that are so sad along this issue. Then you have the issue of, you have Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey and Pakistan. They've housed millions of refugees. And these are poor countries. Yet the richest, the most powerful country in the world is having a debate over really a percentage of these refugees. And as was eloquently stated by Katie, that you have to go through the most elaborate national security apparatus to get vetted to even have a consideration for entry into the United States. So immediately you're viewed as a security threat. And that is another problem that we are facing in our community, is that American Muslims are viewed only through the lens of securitization. That's the only time they're important. Their work in the inner city, like here in Chicago, in terms of free medical care for the indigent, in terms of graduating at the top universities of our country and gaining the best jobs, these immigrant stories are not being told, and how we are contributing to the United States. Not only contributing in these ways, but also contributing in terms of national security. How many Muslims now have enlisted in the armed forces, like the family of Humayun Khan, who sacrificed his life for our country? We are not getting that narrative right now. It is only a drop in the bucket. We are not hearing stories of Muslims in partnership with law enforcement to foil the tactics of Al-Qaeda and ISIS trying to recruit our young men and our young women. How many of those plots have been foiled because of our partnership with law enforcement? So I think that leads to the perception that there is a greater problem than what it really is. And finally, I think the issue that we're going back to from a macro level is we are creating a Muslim ghetto in America. Not a physical ghetto, but a psychological ghetto. Whereas Muslims in Europe live in physical ghettos. When we talk about Muslims in England, we really mean the Indo-Pakistanis of England. When we're talking about Muslims in France, we really mean the Algerians of France. And they are not achieving citizenship or integration. So we are creating that same sense of isolation and alienation that, number one, is un-American. It's bad for our country. It goes against the values of America. What makes us American is the Constitution, is our sense that we will all live in coexistence. And this presents us an opportunity. How can Islam and Christianity and Judaism coexist in peace in America that we can export to the rest of the world? This is seen in the number of interfaith activities in our country in every city. These stories are not being told. The only story about the interfaith is we get together for Ramadan and we invite the police and they get fat on our food because they don't fast. And the rabbi and the priest come and they say a few things and the imam goes and says a few things. And those are fine. Those are nice stories, but they're not the real story. So we haven't even scratched the surface of real stories of resilience of the refugees, stories of the Muslim hero, not just the Muslim terrorist, stories of the immigrant that is working harder than the other person because he or she want to make a difference in America, and stories of how America is creating that opportunity. There are so many opportunities before us. But then the politicians go and they, oh, we're not vetting them right. Oh, these are nonsense. And I think that's what we have to say. This is nonsense. Look at the facts. And it's a tragedy when our country, the greatest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world now, is basing policies and opinions that have nothing to do with facts. You can deal with hysteria, but leadership requires bursting through that perception of hysteria. It's coming up with solutions. And I think Michael and Katie, eloquently, I'm so proud to be on this panel with them. I thank the Chicago Council for making this possible. I wish these are the voices we hear more in the media about what we're doing on this issue so that we can come to our senses and really move on and deal with the threats that are facing our country internationally and here domestically. And the biggest threat is this idea that we're going from a pluralistic society to a nationalistic society.
Yeah. Michael, let me ask you, so, this perception it doesn't just apply to Muslim communities. Immigrants in general are being painted with this brush of criminality or terrorism. If you're in law enforcement and your job is to protect all of these communities, Salam mentioned that it's a lot of the Muslim communities themselves that are bringing forward these cases to law enforcement. Think about communities like the Hispanic community, which is a lot of the criminality is being perpetrated by their own people. Like, how do you build trust in these communities? What is law enforcement? We hear a lot about these ideas of sanctuary cities and protecting criminals, but there's an underlying concern there about engaging with communities before there's a problem, so that when there is a problem, you can do your job.
Well, sanctuary cities is a great example that continues to be an incredible fight.
And misunderstood?
Misunderstood by many people. Frankly, I worked at the Chicago Police Department. I'm very proud of the fact that under the former mayor, we passed an ordinance to be a sanctuary city. The Chicago Police Department at the time enacted a policy where officers were not allowed to ask about immigration status of any kind. And Cook County followed suit with that. It is incredibly important, in my opinion, because if you are going to build trust with communities, there is no way that a member of a community is going to report a crime or an issue if they are frightened or in fear that either they or someone they love or care about will be deported or trucked off to an immigration officer. That is an opinion that is shared by those of us in sanctuary cities. I was frankly surprised when I went to meetings in Washington, and there were police executives that had a viewpoint that was very, very, very different than that. I mean, it was one of those moments where you think to yourself, wow, I really do live in my own bubble in some respect. I thought I understand the other perspective. I'd never heard it so vocally put in a meeting of law enforcement officers of the fact of why we needed to have local law enforcement engage in immigration enforcement. It is a very, very strong opinion. It is one that I definitively disagree with because the job of local law enforcement needs to be to build relationships of trust with community. We are the ones, all of us, working with local law enforcement that should have ownership of our communities, right? That we should be working collaboratively. Federal law enforcement has a very, very important and critical role to play, but they are not the people that are knowing who your neighbors are or should know who your kids are in the most positive ways, right? The sort of Norman Rockwellian view of what we can be with community policing. And to build those communities of trust, you need to start from getting to know one another and trusting one another legitimately that you are all working towards the same goal. That has not been the case with law enforcement and our communities across the board. I'm a sworn law enforcement officer. I get nervous when I get pulled over. I cannot imagine putting myself in the shoes of someone that is of a different faith or that black, brown, or wearing a hijab. It's unimaginable to me. We need to do a much, much better job of talking about these issues and being honest and real about them as law enforcement and as a community about where we can make progress and where we can make change. And that really has to happen in law enforcement agencies. It needs to be a strong point of the leadership, and it needs to be encapsulated across the training. We talk about community policing, but we don't mean it. It's a throwaway term. It's like a CAPS officer. We have a community policing officer. Well, every officer should be a community policing officer, right? Not one person sitting in one desk that does a community fair every once in a while or shows up for the interfaith breakfast. By the way, it was me. I ate all the hummus and shawarma. I'm sorry, but my wife noticed. But I really do believe that it needs to be it's almost like for the foodies out there, it needs to be totally deconstructed. And needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. That's the only way we're going to get there, and that's a long process.
So we have just a couple minutes before we open up for questions. Katie, one last thing. What do you think it will take to bring the United States back to a place of welcoming refugees? I mean, you've mentioned there's pockets, but we're having this national debate right now. Michael, very well established that this isn't new to us, that we've had these fears and concerns. We've managed to overcome them in the past. What do you think is something that we could do to try to overcome some of these concerns?
It's a great question, and I think I always tend to err on the side of being hopeful and having faith in my country. I think that we go through these blips. This certainly isn't the first time. It's a real trend of intensified fear of the stranger, of the newcomer. But I think from our country's birth, we've really been a country of welcoming immigrants and refugees. And, I have faith that we'll get through this current situation. I actually had the opportunity last week to see Madeleine Albright speak at the White House, who, as many of you may know, is a refugee herself. And I found what she had to say quite inspiring. What I didn't know about her is that she'd been a refugee twice. So her family was initially displaced during World War II, and they went to London, and then were eventually able to return to the Balkans, and then they were displaced again during the Cold War from the former Yugoslavia, and that's when they came to the United States. Madeleine was a child during both of these periods of displacement, but she talks about the way her father would compare their experience of displacement and refuge in Europe versus their experience arriving in the United States. And her father said that when they were in Europe, people would say to them, "Oh, I'm so sorry what happened in your country. You're welcome here. When are you going home?" And when they came to the United States, they were met by people that would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear what's happened in your country. You're welcome here. When are you going to become a U.S. citizen?" And I think that really reflects what's great about America. We want people to be American, and we want people to integrate. And I think that's one of the best things about the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program and the work that the NGOs do on the ground to very quickly bring people into a point of self-sufficiency and make them members of society, learning English, getting, some of the European countries, they're kind of supported by the state for years, whereas in the U.S. they're quickly brought into the workforce. And I think that that's a lot of what really makes the U.S. great. These refugees, these immigrants, these very resilient individuals from all over the world, the survivors really. I've met so many of them in the work that I do. They're just the most inspirational people you ever meet. They become part of the fabric of who we are. And so I do think that will prevail. I'd like to think that it will.
Keep optimistic. Okay, so I think we have some questions. Brian's going to help moderate the questions from the audience.
Terrific. Thank you to everyone on the panel. And I now want to open it up to our audience here to have a chance to pose your questions. Yes, please, right here. There's a mic coming right behind you. If you just introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Miriam. I'm a graduate student at Northwestern. I'm with the Medill News Service. We've been hearing for a long time that when it comes specifically to Syrian refugees, that in the screening process, they're subjected to additional scrutiny that other refugees are not subjected to. But there's not really a lot of information about what that entails or what the criteria is for those additional levels of scrutiny. So do you have any or would you be able to share any information on those processes?
I'll try and take it. So I'm not aware of additional processes because of someone's country of origin specifically without some sort of, for lack of a better term, a trigger or an answer into a question. Happy to connect you to the folks at the Department of Homeland Security, though, that could probably provide you a more detailed answer than my non-answer. So
what I might be able to provide a little tiny bit more information from DHS. It involves an additional deeper check of existing known information, and as well as we share a lot of information with other countries who have knowledge of the region to try to inform our decision making when we're interviewing refugees. So for folks from that area, and not just Syrians, but folks from that area, that extra layer may involve talking to other countries that are also interviewing refugees to say, what do you know about this particular town and area and who was doing what, as another layer of ensuring that what people are telling us is the truth.
Terrific.
If that's helpful.
Right here, please. Yeah. There's a mic coming right behind you. There you go.
My name is Tariq Khosa. I've come from Pakistan. I'm visiting Chicago for a couple of weeks. It's a fascinating discussion which I've heard. My background is law enforcement. Michael, for 4 decades, I have served in Pakistan's police service. And I can relate to what your sentiments are, and my questions are basically addressed to Salam and Michael in the context of immigration policy, terrorism, security challenges. Pakistan is a case study of how the immigration policy floundered. 4 million refugees, 1979 Soviet invasion, still 2.5 million refugees in there. And out of that, through state policies and other international interventions, we found that a jihad industry was created within the refugee community. And we found proxy wars being fought between Saudi Arabia and Iran on our soil. My particular question to Salam is here that how is the battle of hearts and mind, being sorted out within the Muslim community in the United States? And how are you dealing with this issue of proxy wars between different sects of Islam and different countries who have their agendas? So what is your indigenous contribution to the internal debate where you talk of perceptions amongst the community, but where is the internal debate within the Muslim community about what is pluralistic Islam all about? And the issue is religious extremism. And I have faced it throughout my career. And that is where the challenge lies. How are you dealing with counter-violent extremism? And what is the debate going on? And what is your strategy as a Muslim community and as Muslim Public Affairs Council? I'd love to hear that. Michael,
All in
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
No.
Michael,
can touch
I
on
think
it.
you
Oh,
have
that was
addressed
only half
the
of
core
it.
issue of policing. The core issue of policing is community engagement, problem-oriented policing, identifying the issue and addressing that. And don't you agree that we have unfortunately militarized our internal security strategies? It has happened in Pakistan. We've seen that our internal security strategy is militarized. We haven't engaged with the community. We are not addressing the issue of what the understanding and issues of the community are. And that is what the challenges of policing lie in the United States as well. We have learned it the hard way, and that's what the situation there is in the internal security challenges that we face. So these fault lines are to be addressed. Brief responses for both.
Brief responses.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you for
Sorry
coming.
longer
It's okay.
observation.
You guys have dinner coming, right?
Yeah.
Useful to have the comparison. Please.
These are, first of all, these are excellent questions. I think these are the issues that need to be raised, and hopefully we can continue the conversation in future panels and forums. First of all, I think another positive story that I wish would be told is the great partnership between communities and law enforcement in the post-9/11 era. I mean, I believe that law enforcement has handled much of these issues in the most professional, patriotic, and decent way that preserves human dignity. And there are excellent relationships throughout the United States between the American Muslim leadership and law enforcement. So I think that that's a story that's still untold. On the issue of immigrants and how we deal with refugees and how external forces exploit these situations and how we're dealing with it here. Number one, this is a battle of ideas. There is a civil war of ideas between those who see Islam as an ideology of compulsion and of confrontation, distinct from those who believe Islam belongs in a global pluralistic society and is involved in constructive engagement to see how we can contribute to the concerns and the aspirations of the world. And those who believe in the confrontational approach are exactly doing what you're saying. They're exploiting jihad. They're taking jihad and bastardizing that word to say this is holy war, you go and kill and you'll get martyrdom, and then all your problems will go away. And I believe that's what led to what Omar Mateen did. His identity crisis, his questions about his own sexual orientation, and then at the last minute, he pledges allegiance to Baghdadi thinking that is going to give him paradise. He's up for a big surprise. But these are the lies that are infiltrating our internet, our communities, and exploiting poor refugee communities. They're being used, as you said, to recruit them to come in this false, this ideology that is really morally bankrupt. So it is confronting that ideology of death, that cult of death, with our theology of life. Islam stands for mercy, you stand for cruelty. Islam stands for justice, you believe in the iron fist. Islam says, convert the enemy to a friend, you say everyone is an enemy who doesn't agree with me and shall be destroyed. That contrast needs to be crystal clear to not only our community but to the rest of society, to understand that it is not a Muslim versus Judeo-Christian conflict, but it is humanity against terrorism and the terrorism industry. That is what is at stake. And the last thing in terms of countering violent extremism, what we're doing, partnering with law enforcement, but also partnering with mental health experts. And I have a friend here, Dr. Steve Wine from the University of Illinois here in Chicago. And part of the problem is that we're telling law enforcement to deal with the problem that they are not equipped to deal with. This is a social, theological, mental health issue. This is not a criminal investigation issue. And even when you have, for example, Rahimi, who was reported by his father, they didn't find anything, so the investigation had to close, or they have to go and conduct a sting operation that stigmatizes the whole community. But if we bring in mental health experts and religious counselors and other people so that families know where to go, the Mateen family, the Rahimi family, and in Fremont, there was a family where the guy had to call the FBI and his son is gone for 30 years. I wish we had the alternative of saying, I'm going to call health and human services. I'm going to call mental health experts. I'm going to call my mosque to come and rehabilitate my son. And if he can't be rehabilitated, then that's another matter. But that is where we're at, because if we don't use that approach, then we're stuck with either imprisoning innocent people that could have been rehabilitated, or stigmatizing the community, or the family ends up doing nothing, or law enforcement closes the investigation, and we have a case of what happened in Chelsea and New Jersey. So it is through the lens of public health that we have to look at this problem and the war of ideas. We cannot arrest our way out of the problem here, and we cannot bomb our way out of the problem over there.
Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think Salam is not surprisingly all correct in everything that he has just said. I couldn't agree more. Usually when people talk about militarization in law enforcement in this country, they are referring to equipment and the move to equip law enforcement agencies with military-style tactics and equipment. It is certainly an issue and a problem that the community has raised. We need to work collaboratively on how to address that, because unfortunately the incidents that we see all too often in this country often require a response where officers are provided that style equipment, but it needs to be highly specialized units that are highly trained and very well equipped and know how to use it well, right? This is the old thing about the go bag in your trunk. If you never take it out and check the batteries or use it, then you're probably not going to use it well on the day of the event. That's why you see in some of these instances, Ferguson is a perfect example, horrific tactics being employed with equipment that people are not well trained on using. But the broader point on militarization, I think, goes exactly to Salam's issue that he discussed so eloquently, which is the strategy that we employ. And that strategy in law enforcement cannot be one of interdiction at all points with an effort to insert an undercover informant or a confidential informant or attempt to charge somebody with material support. If the opportunity exists, and it is as likely, if not more likely, that we could get that same individual motivated and inspired to act in a different, more productive, engaging way that will benefit all of society, which I think a lot of these young men, and some young women, but mostly young men, can be engaged with. And we have experience in that. We have 50 and 60 years of research in gang intervention strategies, in narcotics intervention strategies, in addiction strategies that can be employed to that end. It's something that collaboratively and we have worked on with the mental health community. Steve, who Salam mentioned, has been on the forefront of a lot of that work with us in law enforcement to do it. And it's incredibly advantageous, and it sends a very strong message. One last thing, you asked about the success of proxy efforts. I think if you look at our activity and success in Syria as a country, it gives us all a benchmark for where we have not been successful, where we have established red lines and let people walk over red lines, where we have trusted people that we know cannot be trusted, and where we have allowed activity to take place that is causing untold damage and loss of life. And this happens around the world. Yemen is another example. Right? And when you have entire countries that are allies, and we have to work with a lot of different countries, but when the religious figures of one particular country get up and issue a statement or a fatwa basically saying an entire sect of a religion is not accepted or acceptable, this requires us to question who we're supporting and how we're supporting them. I think that's a fair question to ask as a country.
Terrific. I'd like to ask a question to bring us back to policy debates. And as we know, these issues about security and immigration have animated this election cycle, not only at the presidential level, but at races all the way down the ballot, including local races. One of the things that's interesting in listening to you all is that most of the positive suggestions that you've talked about in order to reduce the chances of violence, to increase our security, have really been not border issues at all, right? Mm-hmm. But they have been community issues with the people who we are living among and who are living among us. So I want to ask, are there proposals that have been suggested that are border issues that you think would make us less secure, and particularly ones that may even sound more appealing than you think they are? And then the second question is, are there steps that we can take at the border and we should consider implementing that would help do a better job of creating greater security as well as allowing for the flow of immigration that creates so many benefits as well?
Who wants to take that first?
Why is everyone looking at me?
You can take that first.
I think that, first of all, the Obama administration has made incredible investments in border security, from technology, the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, to sensor technology and cameras. And we just have a huge coastline, over 7,000 miles of coastline. We have a huge border. It's very, very difficult to secure. How one would fathom an infrastructure project of some kind that would try to more securely guard that border by building a gigantic structure of some height, I'm not sure. But it's
big and beautiful and huge.
People say that it's being discussed. I think that we have done a great deal on border security. The reality is where our borders are unsecure, we could all drive 2 or 3 miles from here, not even, and see the incredible impact that the illegal narcotics trade and trafficking is having on our communities. From Inglewood to Austin and Pilsen to Roseland. That, I think, is, if we want a national security problem, the incredible trafficking of millions and millions of dollars worth of narcotics into this country every day, which is fueling gangs, guns, and drugs, is a serious issue that we have not been able to adequately address. But in terms of a national security issue, I think there's been incredible investments over the last 8 years in personnel and technology, and the processes that have been enhanced and which continue to be enhanced for checking of people, and the security checks that are being done, I think were done, particularly in the last several years, intelligently, with an eye towards both efficiency and effectiveness.
So I'm going to take, if I can, just a quick minute to plug over on the table a report that we did at the Bipartisan Policy Center last year about the border, the state of the border. And it's called Measuring the Metrics, Grading the Government on Immigration Enforcement. And we took a serious look at not only what has been done at securing the border, land, sea, and air, but also how we measure how we're doing. Because one of the things, as you mentioned, we've invested an awful lot in technologies, and it has had an impact, and the government doesn't do a really good job of putting those measures out there, so people still believe incorrectly have a perception that our borders are completely wide open and completely insecure, which is not actually the facts of the case. So I admonish you can go pick up a copy on your way out.
And from a global level, I want to look at the issue of what are the consequences of pushing people back, away from our border. So if you look at the issue of refugees, let's say the Syrian and Iraqi refugees, we say, we don't want you, go back. So the decision is, go back to what? Go back to either living under a tyrant named Assad or a terrorist group named ISIS. So we are creating more of a national security threat by pushing refugees back and telling them that they're not welcomed here. And then number two, there's a study that was done, reported in a not-so-bleeding heart liberal newspaper called the Wall Street Journal that says immigration study sees more pros than cons. And I think everybody should read this report that is produced by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And I think that will help us alleviate people's security fears. I think we're dealing with fears more than realities. And then back to, inside the border, when we welcomed Soviet Jews, we had a major program for resettlement because we saw that that was a national interest. I think we see the national interest at stake in resettling refugees coming from the Middle East, South Asia, and other parts of the world. And quite frankly, there is none, unless Katie, I know the work done by groups like UNHCR, Catholic Charities, a number of other groups, they're great, but they are really a fraction of what we did for Soviet Jews. And I believe that we need to invest more in the resettlement and integration. At the end of the day, what we want to see as American Muslims, back to a previous question, is an integrated American Islam that is separate from Middle Eastern Islam, that can define Islam for the rest of the Muslim world, and that can define a relationship between the United States and the Muslim world that is based on interdependence, cooperation, not confrontation, to move away from the paradigm of Islam versus the West to a paradigm of Islam in the West, working for the West, and creating even a new theology for Muslims that will lead to reform around the many issues that are creating these kinds of problems.
Okay, last word.
Just really very quickly, on the National Academy of Sciences report, two important facts that it pointed out. One, the economic impact of illegal immigrants to this country, unauthorized immigrants, was actually beneficial to the country and non-impactful to native wage workers. And it found that second-generation immigrants in this country actually contributed more to the tax base and the economic growth of this country than native wage workers or illegal immigrants. So the story is a phenomenal one. The end story is really a persuasive one about why this is important as an issue, regardless if someone is legal or quote-unquote illegal.
Terrific. Well, unfortunately, we need to end this conversation now. I think one of the marks of a good conversation is when the program comes to an end, but clearly the issues aren't talked out. And this is an important conversation that we're not only having in this room, but is very much part of our public debate. And we really appreciate all of you being here to help bring new perspectives and viewpoints into the debate and the way that we're thinking about it. I will highlight, in addition to the report that Teresa flagged, that we have a new report that will be released in October that talks exactly about these issues of balance and security, jointly by the Chicago Council as well as the Bipartisan Policy Center. So please join me in thanking this panel for a terrific discussion. I look forward to seeing you back for more.